Holding a razor blade is really the only thing a safety razor has to do. And so the way it holds that blade is obviously extremely important for the results you get while shaving with that razor. And it's kind of intuitive that you would want a rigid, firm edge when shaving. Imagine chopping an onion with a floppy, bendy knife. Not only is it ineffective and imprecise, it's also dangerous. And so, for the same reasons that you want a firm, rigid edge when chopping onions, you also want a firm, rigid edge when chopping through your beard. So, the question is, how do you make a bendy, floppy razor blade rigid? Hey, I'm Shane. Today I'm going to show you 3 different ways that razors are designed to rigidly clamp a blade. The first style of blade clamping is what we call edge-to-edge blade clamping. And that is when the blade is supported on the underside and on the top, pinched between the top cap and the support structure on the base plate. This is on our Osprey adjustable safety razor, and it has probably the best blade clamping in the industry. And that's because it can clamp edge to edge and extremely close to the cutting edge. And so you can see here the blade doesn't bend or flex, pulling either direction. And that is true across the entire width of the blade, making it incredibly rigid. Now lately, this has become extremely popular and our customers ask for it more and more. And I think it's because intuitively, this makes sense as the best way to clamp something. Just hold it right at the edge and you don't have to have any tricks. It seems like the best way to clamp a blade. And it's a very good way to clamp a blade, but it isn't the only one. The biggest advantage to holding a blade like this is that the flatness or bend of the blade here doesn't matter. Since we are clamping right at the cutting edge, the rest of the blade is completely immaterial. In fact, you could chop off the other half of the blade or the other 3/4 of the blade, and it would still shave well because it's clamping right here. That lets you change the geometry of this, making it flatter, letting you have a shorter, thinner razor head, and that can be extremely advantageous. It's also really good for marketing, frankly. Customers really like this style of clamping, and so we increasingly try to do it for our razors because our customers ask for it. But it's not a gimmick. It's incredibly effective, and it's a wonderful way to clamp a blade. The drawbacks to it, though, are that you are limited by the geometry of your base plate. For the Osprey, we are lucky that the base plate is multiple components, and so we don't have to worry about this undercut here. This is really difficult, though, to machine in one piece. And so if you're doing a traditional 3-piece safety razor like the Blackbird, it's really difficult to have this perfect edge-to-edge blade clamping. And there are ways to do that, but you have other drawbacks in creating that kind of edge-to-edge blade clamping on a traditional 3-piece. So we use different strategies for something like the Blackbird that gives just as rigid a blade edge as you'll see in a second, but allows us more versatility for designing the base plate. Okay, here's a Blackbird, and I've chosen a nice blue anodized titanium one for some contrast. You can see the blade clearly. In contrast to the Osprey, you can see that there is almost no support on the underside of the Blackbird's blade. It's supported only up here by the base plate, and then of course it's supported very far out to the edge from the top cap. And at first glance, when compared to the Osprey, you might think, oh, this thing is going to have a lot of blade flex, a lot of blade movement, because there's no support on the underside. But as you can see, it doesn't actually bend at all. Now, of course, it bends down, but that's not the direction we shave. And so the rigidity of the blade only actually matters in the plane that we're shaving. And the force applied is in this direction, up towards the center of the top cap. And so we actually only really care about preventing blade flexion when shaving in that direction. In other words, when the force is applied this way. And so we actually only care about this force and preventing blade flexion in that direction. So we can actually get away with this bending downward because we don't care, because we don't shave that direction. And there's also a bit about forces here. You can see when I'm applying this force, I'm actually going up. And that's also not the direction we shave. Now there is a small bit of the force that's applied in that direction, but the Blackbird was also designed with a very shallow shaving angle. So you shave with the top cap close to your skin. That means that this has a very acute angle with your skin, and so most of the force of the shaving goes actually into the tip of the blade and is transferred up through this curved architecture. And so that force is actually taken up by the rest of the blade. Think of like the way bridges are curved to distribute that load. That's what's happening here. And so because we use a shallow angle, only a very small amount of the force is actually perpendicular to the way that the blade is held. And that perpendicular force is what causes the blade chatter, the blade flexing that we're trying to avoid. So by clamping the blade from the top very close to the shaving edge, and by having this nice sharp bend, and by having a shallow shaving angle that distributes the load back through the blade, by doing those three techniques, we are able to get just as rigid and just as predictable shaving performance from something like the Blackbird, despite having almost no support from the bottom. Now, the drawbacks here are you have to incorporate this curved blade. You have to think about your angles very carefully. And so you have to be really deliberate and considerate when you're creating a razor like this. Whereas with the Osprey, we actually don't really have to think too much about shaving angles or about the curvature of the blade, because we can get away and kind of cheat those things with really nice edge-to-edge blade clamping. We don't have that luxury with the Blackbird, but it does free us up for different architectures and different base plates designs that we can't get away with something like the Osprey. And so again, you get similar performance, but just two entirely different ways of doing it. Okay, the third way that razor makers clamp a blade rigidly is a slant razor. Now, a slant razor takes a DE blade and it twists it. And so you can see that this side to the center is actually shorter than from this side of the top cap to the center. This macro shot makes it hard to tell, but I will show you in a second. And when you twist the blade, you actually also have the blade get closer to the safety bar and further away from the safety bar. Now, the reason that you do that is because you get all of the advantages of the Blackbird top cap style clamping we talked about, while supporting the edge, bottom edge very little. But you get an additional component, and that is a tension across the cutting edge. Think of the cutting edge as a guitar string. And as you twist this blade, you're actually creating tension across that edge. And so like a guitar string, it's going to get tighter and tighter and tighter. And so it's another way of adding rigidity by twisting the blade. And so a slant is very rigid without supporting the underside because it combines the top cap angle approach that the Blackbird style clamping does with this torsional twisting action that creates much more rigidity here at the edge. And we can see that even though the blade sticks out further at this part of the slant than it does at the far edge over here, that we get very little, really no flex. Some of the benefits here are that you don't have to worry as much about the angle approach like you do with the Blackbird. That shallow shaving angle from the Blackbird doesn't really apply here. And so you can have a lot more angle flexibility, versatility, like the Osprey style edge-to-edge blade clamping. The downsides here are they're pretty complex to make. They are not nearly as simple to design or produce as a Blackbird. They're also annoying to line up a beard or your sideburns because this blade sits at an angle. So there's some annoying parts to it. But very rigid way to clamp a blade, and it creates for an incredibly stable cutting surface with this torsion applied. So with those three styles of clamping a blade, you might be wondering which one should you pick? And there isn't an answer. The reality is that, and the point of this video, is that there are multiple ways to accomplish the same thing. The goal is important. The goal is to create a rigid fixed blade. Of that, there's no question. It is the best way to shave. But the way you get there is completely different. And it doesn't matter too much. So don't overthink it. But the point of this video is to show you that just because a blade isn't clamped at the underside, edge to edge clamping, doesn't mean that it isn't rigid. And just because a blade is clamped edge to edge, doesn't mean it's the best razor ever, or doesn't mean that there are cons to that. And so I hope this video gives you some insight on what we as razor makers and designers think about when we design a razor and how we fix the blade within the razor head. And I hope it gives you something to think about when you make your next razor purchase. So as always, if you have any questions or feedback, leave a comment here or shoot us an email to support@blacklandrazors.com. It's always great to have you. See you soon.